investors, substantial investment, only available to people from treaty countries, and it could be a number of modalities. So it could be either I, myself, a Mexican citizen, buy a Canadian company. It's going to be a substantial investment. I want to bring myself as a Mexican, as an investor under NAFTA. I own a Mexican company. I'm the majority owner of that Mexican company. That Mexican company is making an investment in a Canadian company. They're buying a Canadian company. I want to bring myself as an investor. So those are the two options that you can do it. We normally prefer to do it through the corporate investment, but it's not necessary in theory. Or I myself, I'm a Canadian, Mexican person. I buy a company in Canada. I want to bring my right-hand person to help me navigate that investment as my employee. That's fine. Or I, Mexican person, buy Canadian company. I own more than 50% of that Canadian company. I want to move one of my employees. I want to hire someone as an employee to manage that company. I can do that as well. But those are basically the only options there. And again, it's always very important that either the company that's investing in Canada or the individual investor, the person who owns that Canadian company, needs to come from the treaty country. Any questions? Just making some notes of something. Okay, so let's move to CETA then. So CETA has two options for investors. One for a work permit and one to enter as a business visitor. The business visitor is actually quite interesting because it's something that we don't find in any of the other treaties. So the work permit one is under LMIA exemption T46, and it actually says again that it follows similar principles as NAFTA. So if you're doing the work permit there, it's pretty, I mean, it's going to be similar. I would use the NAFTA guidelines, so it's similar to what we have been discussing. Mainly the person who's coming is either the investor, so that's this, I mean, or they will be establishing, developing, or administering the operation of an investment in a capacity as supervisory executive, or they are employed by an enterprise that has committed or is in the process of committing a substantial amount of capital. So that's pretty much the same that we saw in the other ones. You are yourself the person who's making the investment, or you're coming to operate it, or you have an employee who's coming to operate it. And again, the company here or the investment needs to be owned at least 50% by people who are from the treaty country. The main difference I would say probably between this type of work permit in CETA and the other treaties is that it's a one-year one, and it's only in discretionary cases that they'll give you an extension. So it tends, like the other one, it's 1 year, but you can extend it for 2 years. And I've seen some like treaty investors who just like, they stay here for like 10 years. They just keep extending and extending. I think with CETA, if you read the guidelines, it seems to be like it's a lot that, I mean, we haven't, again, because we haven't gotten to the point where we've had like a year after CETA. We don't know how those extensions are going to look like, but it seems to be like they're more difficult than with the other treaties. Okay, so that's option number one for investors under CETA. Option number two, and again, this is totally innovative with this program, business visitor for investment purposes. So in other CPDs, we've talked about business visitors. Business visitors in general, they're regulated by two sections of the regulations, section 186 A, sub A, and section 187. So they, and 187 is basically the section that provides for what a business visitor is, kind of like the requirements. Main thing, people who are doing international business, entering Canada, they're employed by a foreign company, they're coming here for either, I don't know, like training or to sell goods or stuff like that, or they're doing something where they're not entering the Canadian market, okay? So that's always it's pretty limiting what you can do under those sections, and you can enter and work without a work permit. That's one of the work permit exemptions. Under CETA, we have a little twist on this. We could have an employee in a managerial or specialist position who's responsible for setting up an enterprise but does not engage in direct transactions with the general public and will not receive direct or indirect remuneration from a Canadian source. They can enter as what's called a business visitor for investment purposes. I mean, that's something that, I mean, that's a situation where you maybe could have made a pitch under 186 and 187, but it's a little bit tricky. If you have the option to do it through CETA, much easier because you can say, well, the treaty specifically provides for that. And I'll give you an example. So anyone, and actually it could be anyone, it could be someone from any country, but let's give the example of a British national sets up a company in Canada, a new investment, it's running. They need to send someone to kind of like oversee that investment, maybe set it up, maybe set up something new. Maybe the investment is kind of like, I don't know, opening like a new line or something. They're going to be putting money in there and they need this person to oversee that. They can send someone sorry, I was just getting a phone call in. Okay, so they can send someone to oversee that as long as they're still being paid abroad. Obviously, they would have to be from like one of the European countries. They would have to be paid abroad, and they cannot be engaging the general public. So that's an option. So you can send this person. It probably might have been, I mean, again, it's borderline with what a business visitor to begin with is. It just could have been a little bit difficult to sell as a business visitor before CETA, because this person at the end of the day is helping the Canadian investment, is helping that Canadian company. So even if they're not being directly remunerated, paid by that Canadian company, they are helping that. They're providing a service to that company. So in that sense, if you try to do that application not through CETA, then maybe you could have had officers or border officers tell you, no, well, even though you're being paid by a foreign source, you are benefiting a Canadian investment or a Canadian company by being here. So now it's easier. Now it's saying, okay, no, there's a treaty. The treaty specifically provides that if I send this person in a managerial or a specialist position to oversee this investment, they can be in Canada for 90 days. And then you can use the treaty for that. The thing with business visitors under CETA is that they have a maximum of 90 days in a 6-month period. So they could do that again after the 6 months, but they're limited there. And my general recommendation whenever it comes to CETA is that if you can fit someone under 186 or 187, then just do it. Don't use CETA because like you're limited for, unless I mean they're only coming for like a month and it doesn't really matter, or 2 months. But do keep in mind that it's limited to 90 days within a 6-month period. Any questions about this? So again, we can have just the general work permit, same NAFTA guidelines, or this business visitor for investment purposes, a short-term entry, still paid abroad, but they can oversee a Canadian operation. And again, that's something that in the past, I think a lot of officers have been like, well, you kind of like need a work permit for this, but now we can use CETA to say, no, they're just coming to oversee an investment. They're not being paid here. Even though they're benefiting that Canadian investment, they're allowed to do this under the treaty. Okay, transition to permanent residence. This is not a permanent residence program. Can we use this experience in Canada or this work permit to eventually transition these people to permanent residence? So some of the similar concepts that we've talked about with the ICT, 1 year full-time employment in Canada, you can be eligible for arranged employment, and you can be eligible to 50 or 200 points depending on the knock that you've had. Now, the important thing here is that this is only going to apply to those who come as employees of a company constituted in Canada, okay? So with the ICT, it's simple because everyone who's coming to Canada under an intracompany transfer, they're coming as an employee. If you got a treaty investor visa and you're just coming, I mean, you come under a work permit, but you're not coming as an employee of the company that you're operating, or the investment that you're operating, then you can't really claim arranged employment because you're not going to be an employee of X company. If you structured in a way that you come as an employee of the Canadian company, or if you're doing that example that we talked about, that you send an employee to oversee the investment, or they come with you to oversee the investment, and they're on the payroll of the Canadian company, then after 1 year of working for that Canadian employer listed in their work permit, they can claim the points for arranged employment. So they have to be an employee. That's an important thing. Can they claim the extra points for Canadian experience? Well, if they own more than 50% of the Canadian employer, they can't. But if they don't, then they could. You could be Mexican investor, bought Canadian company. Canadian company is employing one of your senior managers who's overseeing this company, this investment. They work for that company for 1 year. They'll be able to claim Canadian experience because they're not owners of that company. You are. And they'll be able to claim 50 or 200 points depending whether they're NOC 00 or just any other type of professional NOC. And again, you could always look in the future into possible employer-driven PMP options depending on the employer requirements, how long the company needs to be set up in Canada or the province that you're applying under. But again, keep in mind that if we're talking about owners of more than 10%, you're likely not going to be able to navigate that. Okay, any questions so far? We've done 2 programs. We've done the ICT, we've